Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Good morning. My name is Michelle Feldman, and I'm a policy advocate at the Innocence Project, and we're a national organization that works to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, and we use DNA evidence to prove wrongful conviction cases. And we all have an interest in revealing wrongful convictions because if the wrong person is in prison, the real perpetrator can be out harming other people. So in Pennsylvania, there have been 13 people exonerated with DNA evidence, and the real perpetrators were identified in 8 of those cases, and they went on to commit additional crimes. So there's a real public safety implication. And Pennsylvania was one of the earlier states to pass a post-conviction DNA testing law to improve access for the wrongfully convicted to DNA testing that can prove their innocence. But that law hasn't been updated since 2002. So Representative Nesbit, who's with us today, and Senator Greenleaf, who will be joining us, have introduced legislation to bring the law into line with what most other states are doing now. And I'm also joined today by Marissa Bluestein from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, and Tony Wright, who was wrongfully convicted in 1991 of the murder of Louise Talley in Philadelphia, and Shannon Coleman, who was the victim's niece in the case. And Tony had a fight for many years to access DNA testing, and Shannon and Tony can talk a little bit more about how all the delays and the court battles to get DNA testing led to injustice for both of them. So just very quickly, what the legislation is going to do, it would remove the bar on people who pleaded guilty from accessing DNA testing. Right now, Pennsylvania is one of only 5 states that bars people who pleaded guilty from getting DNA testing, and we know that innocent people plead guilty because 11% of DNA exonerations were through guilty pleas. Also, it would remove the bar on people who are no longer incarcerated or on parole or probation. 36 other states don't have this restriction, and it would also clarify that if there's newer DNA testing techniques that can prove innocence, those people should be allowed to access testing. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Nesbit to talk more about the bill.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Ted Nesbit. I'm the representative for the 8th District that's in eastern Mercer County and northern Butler County. And as a former assistant district attorney, as well as an attorney that represented numerous court-appointed cases, including PCRAs, I see the importance of us revisiting this important legislation so that technology and the court system can be in sync. Right now, the court system is way behind the current technology, and I think as a public safety matter, it's important that we have the right people incarcerated for the right crimes. And unfortunately, we can't guarantee that now unless we use the most up-to-date technology that is available. And I think it's critical that we allow people who have pled guilty for a number of reasons to allow them to have access to the DNA testing that would actually prove their innocence. But more importantly, I think from a public safety perspective, it would also allow us to, this bill would also allow us to make sure that we match the DNA profiles with the FBI DNA database. That would be critical in us finding some of the people that haven't been charged with crimes but should have been. So that's an important part of this component. It would also require the Commonwealth to identify all the physical evidence in a case. In many criminal cases, there's evidence that's collected, but the DNA is never tested, or in fact, it hasn't been inspected by the defense to see if there's actual DNA that could exonerate the person that is charged. There's also part of this bill would remove the supervision portion and requirement. Currently, to file a PCRA petition, which is Post-Conviction Relief Act petition, you have to be either incarcerated or on supervision. And in many of the sex crimes, you could be under a Megan's Law reporting requirement and not be on supervision, so you would be ineligible to file for the DNA testing that I think is critical. So there's a lot of important things in this legislation that I think we need to revamp our system to make it more fair for the defendants, make it more fair for the citizens to make sure that we have the right people incarcerated for the right crimes. So I look forward to working with the Innocence Project on this. I look forward to working with Senator Greenleaf. There's a hearing coming up this morning on this issue, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Representative Nesbit. And now I'm going to have Tony Wright, who was exonerated last year with DNA testing, to talk about his story.
Good morning. Thanks, Michelle. I want to talk about a few things briefly that I think are important in regards to DNA testing. And the first is, my case shows how important it is for the law to help wrongfully convicted get DNA testing. The law shouldn't be an obstacle to someone getting testing. If the law had been clearer, I would not have spent 5 years fighting in court for DNA testing. I filed for DNA testing in 2005, and the state forwarded saying I was not eligible because I confessed. We had to fight all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. By the time we was granted the DNA testing and the results came back and revealed the real perpetrator of this crime, Ronnie Bird, he was in a coma and died a few months later. If I had been able to get testing sooner, Ronnie Bird would have been brought to justice. Maybe he would have given Louise Talley family some closure in this case. The delays cost me more time in prison away from my son and unable to rebuild my life. The law should allow people who plead guilty to get DNA testing. I believe DNA testing is the best evidence in the world. It says two things, yes or no, guilty or not guilty. 25 years ago, DNA was in its infancy stage, but it was at a stage where it could have said it was Anthony Wright. It was at a stage where it could have said it was Ronnie Bird. 25 years later, fast forward to today, is 1,000 times better than it was back then. And for somebody to deny anybody that's accused of a crime or convicted of a crime this testing. I believe it's a huge disservice to everybody. While I didn't plead guilty, I understand the pressure on innocent people to plead guilty because I faced the death penalty. You guys can't imagine the enormous pressure a young person is under with no legal representation present when you're being interrogated, no guardian present when you're being interrogated by these police officers. After spending 25 years in prison, I know there are other innocent people in there, and I hope they can get DNA tested to prove their innocence. I want to say this is an unbelievable time for me, especially this morning. The victim in my case, Miss Louise Talley, as Michelle alluded to earlier, her family stand beside me today. Miss Shannon Coleman, along with her daughter, Lauren. Two unbelievable people has brought so much joy to my life since I came home. The only thing I wanted to prove for 25 years, I didn't care what else happened after that. I wanted to prove to this family I wasn't the person that committed this crime against their loved one, and I wanted my family to know I was innocent for which I was being held for. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. And now we'll have Shannon Coleman come up and say a few words. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm here today because I strongly believe that the state of Pennsylvania needs to change its post-conviction DNA laws. As a family member of a victim, I can tell you that a wrongful conviction is no solace. We did not get justice for my aunt. Anthony Wright served 25 years for a crime he didn't commit. He fought from 2005 to get DNA testing needed to prove that he was innocent. He had to go all the way to the Supreme Court before the tests were granted. While he and his legal team fought for the tests, the real murderer of my aunt was free to commit other crimes and died before he could be charged. I know there are other people like Tony who are wrongfully convicted, and they deserve to be allowed the DNA testing necessary to prove their innocence as well.
And now I'd like to call Senator Greenleaf to talk about the bill.
Well, thank you very much. And so I'm pleased to be here this morning and talk about DNA evidence. You know, there should be no restrictions on the obtaining of proving a person innocent. Why would there be limitations on that? If the person's innocent, they should have access at any time. Of course, we're talking about Harrisburg now. In Harrisburg, we have to be able to give and take and deal with other people, have different views about that. Our founding fathers said, and in fact, William Penn had this view. I know that Ben Franklin had these views. Historically, I do read a little bit about American history, and so did John Adams when he was defending the British soldiers as a result of the Boston Massacre. And during that, what they believed in was that it is better to acquit a few guilty people and convict one innocent person. Though, unfortunately, today in society, we've got that reversed. And they lean towards it's okay to convict an innocent person. It's not okay to convict an innocent person. And we've done that. That's what changed my view about how we should approach law enforcement. And these provisions in here that if you had a confession, well, you know what? A lot of people, I didn't believe this until we looked into it. Some people do confess to things that they didn't do just to get out of there and try to work something out later. The pressure is put on them. That should not be an exception. Or the other exceptions that the judges and the courts have imposed on our legislation. So now we have to fine tune and specifically deal with these issues. But it's not acceptable to convict an innocent person. Not even one person is not acceptable. This legislation will try to address that. We're going to be having hearings on it today. And I think that justice has to be done in Pennsylvania. And this legislation, with all of my people here that are supporting this legislation, and I believe we're in the process now of negotiating with hopefully that we can get the legislation passed with unanimous consent from both sides on this issue. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for supporting the legislation, and sometimes you have to be persistent even when you're dealing with issues like this. And I'm very hopeful that we can pass this legislation this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Greenleaf. And then finally, Marissa Bluestein from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project.
Good morning. My name is Marissa Bluestein. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. I'm very grateful to Representative Nesbit and to Senator Greenleaf for their support on these issues. I think it's very telling that two former members of law enforcement are the ones who are pushing these bills and thinking this is the right thing to do for Pennsylvania. When we passed this law in 2002, it was a vanguard. It was one of the foremost laws in the country to be able to provide post-conviction DNA testing so people can prove their innocence of a crime. In the past 15 years, Pennsylvania has fallen far behind our sister states in keeping up with the technology that Representative Nesbit spoke of earlier, as well as just the needs of justice. This legislation will help to address that in several ways, predominantly, as you've heard, from allowing those who have pled guilty to the crime, as 95% of criminal defendants do, to get access to DNA testing, to allow people who have served their sentences to get DNA testing, to extend the time period in which people can present claims of actual innocence to the courts. We're not asking to open the floodgates, we're only asking for justice, and that's exactly what this legislation does. We look forward to working with both the House and the Senate and the District Attorneys Association in bringing about what we all want: fair access to evidence that can prove innocence and fair access to the courts, so that we no longer have anybody in prison who is serving a sentence for a crime they did not commit.
Thank you. And we're happy to take questions if there are any. All right. Well, we will see you at the hearing at 10 a.m. and thank you for being here.